So, Dr. Michael Arnhem here with Barrister Bernard Bear. Say hello, Bernard. Hello! And today we want to talk about contract law. In particular, when is a contract not a contract? Let us start with when a contract is a contract. Yes, I agree with you, Bernard. Probably best to start with the question of when a contract is a contract. What is a contract exactly anyway? I think most people are vaguely familiar with the term, although they may not be very familiar with the exact requirements. But actually, the whole of business is regulated through contracts. A contract is basically something for something else. That's putting it a bit too broadly. But you need offer, an acceptance, and consideration, which means price, sometimes called valuable consideration. But what exactly does that mean? Does a contract have to be in writing? No. Actually, the vast majority of contracts in everyday life are what we call oral contracts, sometimes called verbal contracts, or in old-fashioned language, parol contract, P-A-R-O-L, a parol contract. That means one which is not written down. So when you buy a newspaper, there's no writing, except in the newspaper, but there may not even be any speaking. You just hand over the money, and the newspaper vendor will give you the newspaper. And that is a perfectly valid contract. What if there are some pages missing? Well, yes. If you, having bought the newspaper, you find, let's say, the middle pages missing from the newspaper, then there is a breach of contract on the part of the vendor, and you should be able to get a replacement. I mean, this could end up in court, though obviously not over a newspaper, if the vendor, for example, swears that the newspaper he handed you was complete. There were no missing pages at that point. And then you'll have to prove that, in fact, it wasn't. And it could become quite elaborate. But that aside, most contracts are oral. So when you go to a shop, let's say self-service shop, you hand over the goods that you've selected to the cashier with your money, and the cashier will cash up the money and hand you back the goods that you bought. So you've now exchanged your money for the goods. An offer, an acceptance, and there's a consideration, which is the price. Valuable consideration is the term used, although actually even what is commonly referred to as a peppercorn can be valuable consideration. It's got to be something. It can be something which is actually practically valueless. So that's how oral contracts work. But of course, there is always a danger. Sam Goldwyn said, a verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. Yes, Sam Goldwyn, the famous MGM film mogul, said a verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. Of course, that's a bit muddled because a verbal contract isn't written down at all. maybe what he meant was a verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's not written on. I think the point he was really making was that a verbal or an oral contract is very difficult to substantiate. And of course it will depend on evidence. Evidence. How can you prove that there was actually an agreement here? That is not always easy. If you've ever seen a Judge Judy show, you will know that a lot of her cases involve disputed loans. The one party says, I loaned or I lent the other party $1,000, and the other party says, no, I received $1,000 from her. Yes, but it was a gift. And if it's purely oral, if there's no actual writing, it's very difficult to prove whether it was in fact a loan or a gift. It's got to be evident. That'll depend on the evidence. That's why, if in doubt, it's always best to write down a contract. If you have a contract with anyone, whether it's to buy or sell or lend or borrow or whatever it may be, many different types of contracts, it's best to have it in writing and signed by both parties. That is always the safest policy. And what about promises? Well, promises can form a contract. As I said, offer and acceptance is what you need, and you can have a promise for a promise. You can promise to pay somebody £10,000 for their diamond ring, and they can promise to deliver it, and that is a contract. It's a binding contract, even though no money has actually changed hands yet, and no goods have changed hands yet. It's a promise for a promise. But just a promise by one party without a reciprocal promise, that's not a contract. That cannot be enforced. We use the term enforced. So, for example, if I promise to give you £100 on your 18th birthday, and then I completely forget about it, and when you turn 18 you ask me for the money and I say, oh, I'm sorry, but I've changed my mind, can you enforce that as a contract? The answer is no. There's no mutual agreement there. There's no agreement. Contract is essentially an agreement. But in certain circumstances, you can have a one-sided promise that is enforceable, and that is if it is in the form of a deed. That means a formal document which is, as we used to say, signed, sealed, and delivered. Nowadays that's not required. Sealed refer to the old-fashioned type of sealing wax. That's no longer required. All that is needed now for a document to be a deed is for it to say that it is meant to be a deed, and for the person who is making the gift or the promise, whatever it is, to sign it and to have their signature witnessed by somebody else who also has to sign it. And that is a deed under seal, as we used to say, or simply a deed. It used to be called a specialty. If it's a contract, it can be a specialty contract, as it used to be called. So any contract can be done in the form of a deed, but a deed doesn't have to be a contract. It can just be a promise, and that is enforceable. And it's a much stronger type of enforcement than any other, because an ordinary contract can only be enforced for 6 years, but a deed is enforceable for 12 years. So that's just the bare bones of the subject. We'll be coming back to contracts a number of times in this series, but that's all for now. Catch you next time.